There was a time when doing the weekly shop meant more than filling a trolley. It meant fine fare on the corner, Gateway on the ring road, or Safeway standing proud at the edge of town. These places weren't just supermarkets, they were landmarks of everyday British life, woven into routines, memories, and childhood Saturdays. Some vanished slowly, others almost overnight, leaving behind empty buildings and half-remembered names.
Before we continue, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if these memories still mean something to you. Because once you realize how many of these stores disappeared forever, you start to wonder, how did we ever let them go? 1. Summerfield. For decades, Summerfield was never the biggest supermarket in Britain, but it was often the closest. Founded in Bristol in 1875 as home and colonial stores, it quietly embedded itself into everyday life, particularly throughout the 1970s, 80s and 90s. These were modest shops on residential high streets, places you walked to rather than drove to, places where the staff often knew your name. The blue and red Summerfield sign became part of the scenery in towns like Taunton, Bath, and small corners of suburban London. Summerfield specialised in convenience before the word became fashionable.
Smaller floor space, shorter queues, and shelves stocked for daily life rather than bulk buying. Milk, bread, a paper, maybe a ready meal for one. In an era before online shopping and self-checkouts, it felt human, almost neighbourly. For many elderly shoppers, Summerfield was the last link between home and the outside world. The end came quietly. In 2009, the cooperative group acquired Summerfield in a $1.57 billion takeover. Within months, rebranding began. Familiar signs vanished. Staff uniforms changed. Some stores closed entirely. Others reopened under new names that felt colder, less personal. There were no farewell posters, no closing down ceremonies. One day it was all Summerfield. The next day, it simply wasn't. And for many communities, something gentle and dependable disappeared with it. 2. Bejam. Bejam arrived in Britain during the 1960s, when frozen food still felt like science fiction, short for British European Joinery and Meats. The name itself was odd, industrial, and utterly of its time. Yet step inside a Bejam store and you entered a vision of the future. Long aisles of chest freezers, frosted lids, the low mechanical hum of cold air. Shopping here felt different from anywhere else. By the 1970s and early 1980s, Bejam stores were fixtures across England, especially in working and lower middle class areas.
Families came to stock up on frozen peas, fish fingers, oven chips, and ready meals that promised convenience in an increasingly busy world. It suited a Britain where both parents were starting to work, where time mattered more than tradition. Bejam's real power lay in how radical it was. This was not about fresh produce or local bakers. This was efficiency, planning, bulk buying. Yet that same rigidity became its weakness. In 1986, Bejam was acquired by Iceland Foods.
Gradually, the Bejam name faded away, replaced by brighter branding and a more aggressive retail style. The freezers stayed. The feeling changed. Today, few remember Bejam by name, but many still remember that first strange thrill of buying an entire week's meals, already frozen, sealed in plastic, ready for a future that never quite turned out the way it promised. 3. International stores. International stores began life in 1879, long before Britain thought of itself as multicultural.
By the post-war decades, particularly the 1950s and 60s, the chain had evolved into something quietly radical. in cities like Liverpool, Manchester, and Birmingham. International stores sold foods that felt unfamiliar to many British shoppers. Continental cheeses, olive oils, tinned goods with foreign labels. It was a glimpse beyond the island.
For immigrant communities, especially those arriving from Europe and later the Commonwealth, international stores offered a rare sense of recognition. Ingredients from home, flavors that didn't need explaining. For others, it was curiosity, a place where the world felt slightly bigger than the street outside. At its peak, the chain operated hundreds of stores nationwide. Yet it struggled as the supermarket giants expanded in the 1970s and 80s.
Tesco, Sainsbury's and Asda could undercut prices, outspend on logistics, and dominate retail parks. International stores, with its scattered locations and old infrastructure, couldn't compete. In 1982, it collapsed into administration. The stores closed, the name vanished. What disappeared wasn't just a retailer, but an early chapter of Britain quietly learning to eat differently. 4. Lipton. Today, the Lipton name is synonymous with tea. But long before tea bags and yellow packaging, Lipton was one of Britain's most recognisable grocery chains. Founded by Sir Thomas Lipton in Glasgow in the 1870s, the stores spread rapidly across the UK. By the early 20th century, there were over 3,000 Lipton shops, often small, tidy, and reassuringly familiar. These were neighbourhood shops, often positioned near tram stops or busy streets.
Lipton built its reputation on cleanliness, consistency, and trust at a time when food quality was far from guaranteed. Housewives knew what they were getting. Prices were fixed. Service was polite. It felt modern without being intimidating. The decline was slow and structural. As supermarkets grew larger and shopping habits changed after the Second World War, small chain grocers struggled. Lipton stores closed gradually through the 1950s and 60s as the brand pivoted towards packaged tea instead of physical shops. The shopfronts vanished, but the name lived on in cupboards across Britain. Few people realised they were still saying the name of a supermarket every time they boiled the kettle. 5. Key markets. Key markets was never glamorous. It didn't aim to be. Emerging in the 1960s, it occupied the awkward middle ground between corner shops and full-scale supermarkets.
These were practical stores, often found in suburban estates or small towns, selling everyday essentials without spectacle. No grand slogans, no revolutionary layouts, just food, priced fairly, within walking distance. For many families, key markets was where routine happened. After-school shopping, a quick stop on the way home from work, familiar aisles, unchanged for years. But that very stability became its undoing. As Britain entered the 1980s, retail changed fast. Superstores offered parking, choice, and aggressive pricing. Shopping became an event, not a chore. Key markets couldn't scale up without losing its identity. It couldn't stay small without losing customers. Gradually, stores closed or were absorbed into larger chains. By the early 1990s, the name had all but disappeared. It left little physical trace behind. But for those who remember, key markets represents a quieter Britain. Before shopping became a battlefield of brands and bargains. 6. Fine fare. For much of post-war Britain, fine fare was not just a supermarket, it was a necessity. Founded in 1927 and expanding rapidly after the Second World War, fine fare became deeply rooted in working-class communities across England, Scotland, and Wales. By the 1960s and 70s, its stores were everywhere, from inner-city streets in Birmingham and Leeds to housing estates built during Britain's Great Rebuilding years. Fine fare was practical, no-nonsense, and affordable. It sold what families needed, not what advertising told them to want. Tinned food, fresh bread, cuts of meat prepared behind the counter. It was where weekly wages were carefully measured against shopping lists, and where parents taught children the value of money. The name itself sounded reassuring. Fine, fair, honest. But the very communities that relied on fine fare were the first to feel the pressure of economic change in the late 1970s. Inflation rose, competition intensified. Larger chains could negotiate better prices and invest in out-of-town superstores. Fine fare tried to modernize, but it was too slow. In the late 1980s, the chain was absorbed into Gateway. The name disappeared. For many, Fine Fare's closure felt less like a business failure and more like the loss of a trusted local institution. 7. Netto. When Netto arrived in the UK in 1990, it looked almost unfinished. No music, no polished aisles, minimal staff, products stacked in cardboard boxes. To British shoppers used to colourful displays and branded abundance, Netto felt stark, even uncomfortable. But that was the point. Netto was a Danish discount chain built on efficiency, speed, and low prices. In towns across the North and Midlands, Netto quietly gained a loyal following. Students, pensioners, and cash-strapped families understood its appeal. It didn't pretend to be anything else. You came for bargains, not experiences. Long before Aldi and Lidl became household names, Netto was already proving that British shoppers would accept less choice in exchange for lower prices. The problem was timing. Britain wasn't ready. Netto struggled with perception. Cheap became synonymous with inferior. In 2010, Asda acquired Netto's UK stores, promising conversion or closure. Within a few years, the red and yellow Netto sign was gone. Ironically, just as the discount model finally conquered Britain, Netto itself had already disappeared. 8. Quick Save. Quick Save felt unmistakably British. Founded in 1958, it thrived on simplicity. No frills, no loyalty cards, just low prices and familiar brands. The bright yellow signage became iconic, as did the plastic shopping baskets that clattered along tiled floors. For many families during the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, Quick Save was where stretching the household budget became an everyday skill. These were not aspirational stores, they were functional. Shelves were packed tightly, lighting was harsh, but people trusted Quick Save. It delivered value when wages were tight and inflation bit hard. In industrial towns and council estates, it was often the most reliable option available. The decline was slow and painful. As supermarkets modernized, Quick Save struggled to update its image. Stores aged, competition intensified. In 2007, the remaining stores were sold to Fresh Express, but the brand was beyond saving. Closures followed rapidly. When Quick Save vanished, it took with it a chapter of Britain where shopping was about survival, not choice. 9. Presto. Presto rarely made headlines. That was its strength. Originally launched as a convenience-focused offshoot of the cooperative movement, Presto stores filled a specific niche throughout the 1970s and 80s. They sat comfortably between corner shops and supermarkets, often located in residential areas where big chains didn't bother to build. Presto was dependable, predictable, a place for top-up shopping, familiar layouts, and fair prices. For many shoppers, it became part of routine life. You didn't plan a trip to Presto, you simply went there, because it was there. In the 1990s, retail economics changed. The cooperative group streamlined its brands. Presto no longer fitted the strategy. Stores were rebranded, sold, or closed. there was no dramatic collapse, no scandal. One day, Presto was still on the sign. Then it wasn't. Its disappearance mirrored the quiet erosion of local convenience in favor of scale and efficiency. 10. Safeway. Safeway arrived in Britain in the 1960s with unmistakable American swagger. Wide aisles, bright lighting, big choice. It felt different from traditional British supermarkets. By the 1980s and 90s, Safeway had become a major force, particularly in suburban England and Scotland. Shopping there felt modern, even slightly glamorous. Safeway introduced ideas that later became standard: extended opening hours, strong own-brand ranges, aggressive promotions. It symbolized a more confident, consumer-driven Britain. But success made it a target. In 2003, Morrisons acquired Safeway after a fierce takeover battle. The result was brutal. Stores were sold, rebranded, or closed to satisfy competition rules. Within a few years, the Safeway name vanished entirely from British high streets. The shelves remained, the buildings remained, but the identity was erased.
For those who remember, Safeway represents a brief era when British shopping flirted with American scale and learned the cost of it. 11. Low cost. Low cost never pretended to be anything other than what it was. Founded in the early 1960s, the chain built its identity around one simple promise: prices lower than everyone else. Stores were sparse, displays basic, choice limited. But for shoppers living through wage restraint, strikes, and rising prices, low cost served a clear purpose. In the 1970s, when Britain faced economic uncertainty and household budgets tightened, low cost thrived. It was a place where pennies mattered, where shopping meant calculation rather than indulgence. Many stores were located in working-class neighborhoods, close to bus routes and housing estates, making them accessible to those without cars. Yet as retail evolved, low cost struggled to adapt. Discount shopping gradually shifted from being about sacrifice to being about smart choice. Newer competitors refined the model, offering cleaner stores and better branding. Low-cost's stripped-back approach began to feel dated. By the 1980s, the chain faded from view. It had done its job, then quietly stepped aside, leaving behind a memory of a Britain that counted every coin. 12. Vivo. Vivo was everywhere, yet somehow nowhere. During the 1960s and 70s, the Vivo name appeared on countless small grocery shops across Britain, particularly in villages and suburban streets. It wasn't a single company in the traditional sense, but a buying group. Independent shopkeepers traded under the Vivo banner to access better wholesale prices. For customers, Vivo felt familiar and dependable. The stores were local. The owners often lived above the shop. You could buy groceries, cigarettes, and sweets in one stop, often on credit. Vivo didn't shout. It blended in. It represented a time when retail still revolved around personal relationships. The problem was scale. As large supermarket chains expanded, buying power became everything. Small independents couldn't compete. One by one, Vivo shops closed or rebranded. By the 1980s, the name had largely vanished. What disappeared was not just a logo, but a retail culture rooted in trust, familiarity, and human connection. 13. Budgens. Budgens occupies a strange place in British memory. Founded in 1872, it became widely known during the post-war decades as a respectable, mid-sized supermarket chain. In the 1970s and 80s, Budgens stores offered something slightly aspirational: a better presentation, quality goods, a sense of calm order.
For many shoppers, Budgeons felt like a step up. It wasn't flashy, but it felt reliable and grown up. The kind of place you went when you wanted something a little nicer than the basics. Yet ownership changes over the years fractured the brand. Stores were sold, rebranded, or converted into franchises. Budgeons still exists today, but in name only. The old national chain is gone. What remains is a patchwork of independent stores using the brand. For those who remember the original Budgeons, something essential has been lost. Not the shop itself, but the feeling of consistency it once represented. 14. Gateway. Gateway rose to prominence during the 1960s and 70s, at a time when British shopping habits were changing fast. Larger stores, wider aisles, car parks. Gateway was where families went for the big shop. It felt contemporary, efficient, and forward-looking. For a generation, Gateway represented progress. Shopping became less frequent, more planned. Trolleys replaced baskets, convenience replaced familiarity, yet Gateway struggled to keep pace with the very changes it helped introduce. Larger competitors expanded faster, branding grew sharper, price wars intensified. By the late 1980s, Gateway was absorbed into Summerfield.
The name disappeared from storefronts, replaced by something quieter, more subdued. Gateway had been a bridge between old and new Britain. Once crossed, it was no longer needed. 15. International hypermarkets. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Britain experimented with the hypermarket idea. Vast stores on the outskirts of towns, selling everything from food to furniture. Influenced by continental Europe, these spaces promise convenience on an unprecedented scale.
International hypermarkets were bold, ambitious, almost overwhelming. But British shoppers were ambivalent. Travel distances were longer. Town centres suffered. The novelty wore off. Planning restrictions tightened. Gradually, the model lost favour. The experiment ended not with failure, but with retreat. Britain chose supermarkets, not hypermarkets. The buildings were repurposed, the signs removed. Few remember the names.
But for a brief moment, Britain imagined shopping differently, and then decided it wasn't quite right. In the end, these supermarkets were never just places to buy food. They were part of Britain's everyday rhythm, woven into routines, memories, and moments that now feel impossibly distant, from quiet high streets to edge-of-town car parks. Each name we've revisited tells a small story about how the country lived, worked, and shopped between the 1950s and the 1980s, and how easily those familiar landmarks can fade away. If you'd like to keep exploring more forgotten brands, lost places, and vanished everyday icons from old-school Britain, click through to our next video and continue the journey back in time.
And if these stories brought back memories of your own, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing what you remember. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again very soon in the next story.